I want to introduce our speaker today, who is Matthew Shepard, the Director of Education and Outreach. And we're really excited about this webinar today to dive into what bee is that and looking at an introduction to commonly encountered bees of the US. So with that, we'll pass it off to Matthew. Thank you so much, Matthew, for being here today.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for that introduction, Rachel. Yeah, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, wherever you are. We do a lot of webinars at Xerces, and I'm always thrilled when I get the opportunity to present one. I'm going to talk for a little while, and then there will be an opportunity for a discussion at the end. And I like to try and make sure that we have enough time for discussion, because I know that that can be a very, well, it always is a very valuable part of any presentation. Because at the end, I'd like you to leave with the information that you'll find most helpful, and not just the kind of things that I think are cool factoids. Sorry, no, we're good. So chances are you all know who the Xerces Society is. We are an environmental nonprofit. Our focus is on protecting insects and other invertebrates, and we are named for the Xerces blue butterfly, which is one of the first insects known to go extinct in North America because of human activity. And this photograph here, this is actually from the 1927 book, Butterflies of California by John Comstock. And it's the only book that I know of that includes the Xerces blue butterfly, because it was last seen flying in 1943, and so had gone extinct before so many of the butterfly books that we see these days were available. I apologize for the pause. I've just been having it at my screen isn't always advancing when I want it to, but hopefully I've got it sorted out now. So the Xerces Society, our mission is protecting nature through the conservation of insects and other invertebrates in their habitat, and essentially that boils down to protecting the life that sustains us, because insects are at the heart of so much of our environment. And as many of you have probably heard, the phrase that E.O. Wilson coined was as the little things that run the world. We work through conservation, so hands-on, on-the-ground habitat work. We partner with farmers and land managers and park managers and gardeners and so many other different people to try and make sure there's habitat on the ground and we're improving the conditions. Because if we don't do that, then we're really not having a big impact. We also get involved with advocacy, so speaking up to protect rare and endangered species, achieving legal protection for some species, trying to get pesticide laws and rules and regulations changed and that kind of stuff. We are involved with research, and sometimes that is research of understanding the biology or the distribution of rare and declining species, and other times that will cover things such as figuring out what is the best way to achieve a good seed bed preparation for a pollinator meadow on an organic farm. Because we are an evidence-based, we are science-based organization, and so we tap into the amazing knowledge of hundreds of scientists around the world in institutions, universities, and so on, to support what we're doing. But also we try and make sure that we are gathering the most relevant information. And then we also work through education, and sometimes that's books, sometimes that's other publications, plant lists, tabling at events, and giving webinars like we have today. Although Xerces has grown, in fact, we've grown significantly just in the last few months, and we now have 70 staff. But we're much bigger than those staff, fortunately, because even with 70, there's so much that we couldn't do. And so we have many thousands of members and individual donors who support our work, plus the foundations who provide grant funding for our projects. There's the scientists that we partner with who make sure that what we do and what we say is based in evidence. The land managers, the agencies, the farmers, companies, so many other people who partner with us, collaborate to undertake habitat projects or to support our work in other ways. And then just the many thousands of people who are just doing simple steps to protect invertebrates in their neighborhood. Thinking about what I'm going to be talking about and hopefully answering your questions on today, the reason why this has got the subtitle of an introduction to commonly encountered bees is because I'm not going to be delving into species level identification. Frequently that involves specimens under a microscope, and you have to deal with very particular little details and complicated, sometimes confusing language. And what I'm wanting to do is to give you enough information so that, visual clues, hints and tips, so that when you're in your garden or your park or out hiking somewhere, you'll be able to see things and you'll recognize it even at the broad level. Sometimes that means genus, sometimes that's even family level. And one reason why I can't go into real depth is, yes, it's complicated, but also I don't have enough time. There are more than 3,600 species of bees in North America. And in your individual state, it'll vary. I mean, the example I have here is Oregon, because that's where I am. And we know that we have 650 species and maybe 800 just in this one state. And in Portland, 100 or 150 species. An individual garden. I mean, I know my own garden, I have 36 species of bees that I've seen in my own small suburban garden. And I know of another garden where researchers have been doing some surveys and monitoring, and they found more than 80 species in one urban garden. And so even to try and, with that diversity, and there's no way that I can, in half an hour, try and guide you down to every little thing. In general, across the United States, the further west you go, the greater diversity. The US is often just divided east and west of the Mississippi. And so east of the Mississippi, there are about 1,500 species. And when you get to further west, you've got more like 2,500 species. California, just as one state, has as many bees in it as the eastern states combined. So there's a huge amount of diversity out there, and trying to understand and study all of that in really species level detail is way more than I know, because I'm not a taxonomist. There are people who have that specialized knowledge, but also way more than we can achieve in the time available. I do want to give you just a brief introduction or some overview of natural history of the bees, because some of this information is helpful in understanding and beginning to identify and what you're seeing. And then after this, I'll dive more into particular groups of bees and help you understand, are you looking at a sweat bee or a leaf cutter or a mason bee or a longhorn, just that kind of level. The life cycle of bees. Many people know, the butterfly life cycle: egg, caterpillar, chrysalis, adult. Bees have that same 4 stages. Most of the stages occur out of sight inside the nest, and for most bees it takes just about a year for those 4 stages to be completed. And this image on the screen here shows a mining bee, which is one of our ground nesting bees. On the right hand side, the bee as an adult will excavate a nest, a narrow tunnel, and from that nest she will make some brood cells, and that's what we have on the right hand side. In that brood cell, she then places the pollen and nectar that she forages for, and then she lays an egg, and at the bottom you can see the egg sitting on top of that moist mound. That mound is typically just called bee bread. And then she will seal that nest, and she will not have any further contact with her offspring. It takes a few days, maybe a week, for that egg to hatch. And then it takes a couple of weeks, and the larvae will eat its way through the food that's left in its cell. And then after a few weeks, the larvae will pupate. It will become the pupa, and will transform from that grub-like larvae through to the adult form. And at that point, the bee kind of remains in suspended animation in a way, and will remain as the pupa for the rest of the year. And the bees have different seasons. And so this mining bee, for example, comes out in late winter and early spring, and this species will be active for a few weeks during that period of time. And during that time, the females will complete the nest making. She may lay 30 or 40 eggs, and that's the total output. And then she will die, and her offspring will remain in the nest until the same season the following year when they emerge. So that was a mining bee, and mining bees are a good representation of the life cycle and habits of bees, because about 70% of our native bees nest in the ground. It's a bit like when you see these nests, people often think they're an ant nest. It's just a small mound of dirt. Sometimes it's in bare ground, sometimes it's in patchy vegetation. But all these bees they just need access to the dirt so that they can dig their nests and create the brood cells and so on. And every species is slightly different in how they do it. Some, the nest will just go down a few inches, 4 or 6 inches. And others are way more complicated and will go down a foot or 18 inches or 2 feet deep. So these really are pretty impressive feats of engineering. Most of our other bees, native bees, nest in pre-existing tunnels, and that might be in a dead tree and a snag. It might be up a hollow twig. There are some species that will chew their way into the soft pith of a twig, but they need a broken twig to be able to get into it. And these tunnel nesting bees, they, like the ground nesting bees, they create a series of brood cells, but they create the brood cells in a series down the tunnel that they make. A lot of people have mason bee nests now, and you can also encounter observation nests. And so this idea, a lot of people have seen this now. And you can see that the tunnel will be divided up into a series of brood cells, and different species will use different materials. Mason bees use soil and mud. That's the lower drawing there. Leafcutter bees are another example, and will trim beautifully shaped pieces of leaf that they stitch together, or glue together with their jaws and saliva. But they're creating a series of cells down that tunnel, and each cell they put the nectar and pollen, create the bee bread, lay an egg, seal the cell, and move on. And then we have the truly social native bees are bumblebees, and they are looking for a small cavity, sometimes an abandoned mouse hole, sometimes a gap somewhere else under tumble down grass, in between rocks, under a pile of sticks, for example. And they will create a nest. The queen will emerge from hibernation, found the nest as a solitary bee, and she'll have a first brood. She makes a series of waxen cells that you can see in the right-hand photograph. This is not honeycomb. These are a series of ball-shaped waxy cells that she makes, and each of those has some food in it and the eggs in it. She will have her first brood of just a small number of bees that she can rear on her own, and then they go out and start foraging and supporting the work of the queen. And gradually, as the nest grows and a few more broods through the summer, there are more and more workers, and the queen spends less and less time outside of the nest. The best way to support these nests is to have some nice untidy areas where rodents or others can get in there, where the vegetation comes tumbled down and forms the kind of sheltered cavities. And these places also have much more benefit than just bumblebees. You know, you might get overwintering butterflies in there. You can have all sorts of good stuff. So that was just a very brief to give you a sense of particularly the nesting requirements of the bees, so you have an idea of what they're doing for their natural history. When we start thinking about bees, and it's like what makes a bee, if you start thinking about bees, I know a lot of people picture either a honeybee and a comb and all that big hive structure, and other people think of fluffy, round, hairy, striped bees. And I mean, this is I admit, a kind of a jokey kids pop-up book image, but it helps give you some of the key elements of a bee over some other animals. They do have 6 legs, and they do have somewhere on their body, they will have a way of carrying pollen. Now, this critter's carrying a beach ball rather than pollen and got it tucked under a front leg. But you'll see that some bees carry their pollen on their rear legs, and some carry them on their abdomen. Bees, and one reason why this is such a good one, is bees have 2 pairs of wings. If you were to look at a fly, you'll see that flies only appear to have 1 pair of wings, but bees very definitely have 2 pairs of wings. And also bees have long antennae, which is another way of helping separate them out from some similar insects. In terms of size of bees range in size from the biggest of the bees, which can be some of our really big bumblebees and our large carpenter bees. They can be 1/4 of an inch long. And then the smallest of the bees, less than 1/10 of an inch long. So they can be really, really tiny, and sometimes they're so small that people don't necessarily recognize them as bees. They just think they're something else. This is to illustrate the different ways in which pollen is carried. The photograph on the left, bumblebees and honeybees, but bumblebees here, they carry the pollen as a moist lump. They mix the nectar with pollen and carry it as a moist lump in the pollen basket. And this is the kind of structure that everybody is vaguely aware of or knows very well. But it's also unusual. There aren't that many bees that carry it as a moist lump. Because most bees will carry their pollen as dry grains, and so they have a really hairy patch on their body. This photograph shows it on its rear leg, and you'll see it's the lower part of the rear leg. Some of the other bees carry the pollen really high up on the rear leg, and so that's the reason for pointing this out now, is that's one of the things you'll be probably looking for when you're looking at bees in the field. And as I mentioned a moment or two back, some bees carry their pollen on the underside of their abdomen. So I've got some examples of bees doing that later on. But you either have the pollen basket with the moist lump, the pollen basket is technically known as a corbicula, or you have it as a patch of stiff, very tufty hairs that are carrying dry pollen, and that structure is known as a pollen brush or a scopa. There are some insects that can be confused with bees. Bees and wasps they're actually very closely related. They're both in the same order of Hymenoptera, but bees are generally hairier. And again, they will have a pollen carrying structure because bees are collecting nectar and pollen to take back to the nest to feed their offspring, whereas wasps are not. Wasps are out collecting food and meat, basically. And I say that because, as you know, yellow jackets will take from your picnic or or your dinner on the patio, whereas most of the wasps are collecting caterpillars, flies, insects of some sorts to take back. Wasps are less hairy. They're frequently slimmer than bees, and sometimes some wasps will fold their wings lengthways, and you can see in this photograph. So it looks like at rest they have a very skinny wings. Another group of insects that can be confusing with bees are flies. The fly is on the right-hand side here, and there's a good reason for flies looking like bees or looking like wasps, because bees and wasps can sting. So if you're a fly that doesn't have a defensive mechanism like that, if you look like something that does, then you're less likely to get harassed or eaten. The way to separate them out is, one, flies have much bigger eyes than bees, and you can see the fly eyes come around the side of the head and most of the way across the face, whereas the bees, the big compound eyes are down the side of the head. And then you also see clearly here, typically flies have just much shorter, smaller antennae, whereas the bees have the much longer antennae. And then flies do have fewer wings, but if you look at these, you'll see it's really difficult to tell just how many wings either of those have. But then the other thing is that flies don't have anywhere for carrying pollen. And the photograph on the left of the bee, you can clearly see the pollen on the legs. So moving into a series of slides of specific bees. I'm starting with the honeybee. The honeybee is not native to this country. It's also not a typical bee. I mean, it's different in so many ways in creating honeycomb, in the size of the hive, in the social structure and the sharing of work and labor, in having the queen and the workers and the nurse bees, etc., etc. But it's like the stereotypical bee, and it's the one that we frequently think of, and many people can recognize and identify. The honeybees, they do carry their pollen as a moist lump on their leg, and although we frequently think of bees as being yellow and black striped, honeybees are striped, but they're not yellow and black. They're a range of colors from kind of golden brown, as you see in one of the photos on the right, through to much darker brown. And they are, in terms of length, mostly around about ½ an inch or longer, although some of them can be pretty small. Bumblebees, and again, I'm starting with bumblebees partly because it's another bee that people recognize and kind of move us closer to that image of the bee as being yellow and black, striped and hairy. These are a social bee. They nest in a cavity. They'll be active from late winter all the way through to the fall, and they are big and hairy and colorful and striped. And so those are some of the easy ways to identify them. And again, when you see one foraging, it carries the pollen as that moist lump on its back legs. And although we frequently think of bees being yellow and black striped, and some bumblebees are, you also find orange stripes on them. You find bumblebees that are primarily black or have white on them. And so there is a great diversity or not a great diversity. There are about a little under 50 species of bumblebees in the US, which is a pretty significant diversity. But not as huge as some of our other genera. In terms of size, you do get small bees and big bees, and there is some variation in the size of the bees between species, but the biggest range of variation is probably within species, and it comes from which brood the bees from in the nest. And particularly early in the year, you'll see the really big queens that have overwintered and are the big bees from last year's nest. And then you'll see the much smaller, sometimes only half the size or less. And those are the early brood of the worker bees that are out foraging. And I have a view of a top of a Japanese maple from my window here, and I've been watching the bees in the last few days. And you can really see a significant difference in size. And yet it's not a difference between species, it's just a difference between the age of the bees. Moving on from some of the easily recognizable bees, mining bees are another one of our very early emerging bees. They come out in late winter, around the same time that some of the early bumblebees are. And they can be, you know, a similar size to a honeybee. And at first glance, you might think it's a honeybee, because these are just, I mean, these are just generally drab. Most of them are brown or gray, almost black. But there's a huge number of species. There are about 550 species of Andrena mining bees in the United States. And most of them are these rather drab nondescript ones, but there are some, like I've got on the lower right there, which are much brighter colors, much more distinct. And you might look at that and think it's a honeybee. But the thing to look for here is that it carries its pollen as dry grains and not as a moist lump. And so you can see the main photo, it has the hairy rear legs, and the hairs go all the way up the legs. And the photo on the right there of one of these bees diving into its nest, rushing into the ground, you see it has the dry pollen all the way up its legs. And so it often carries pollen really high on its rear legs. Another early spring bee are the mason bees, genus Osmia. People frequently think they have flies when they see these, because the orchard mason bee is a chunky little bee, shiny blue, almost black. The color varies a bit depending on whether you're catching it in the sunlight or not. And these frequently will occupy artificial nest blocks in our gardens. The one thing about these bees, because they use their jaws for collecting the mud and so on, they have really wide heads, and that's funny to look for. And as I said, they look like these really chunky little bees, and they do carry the pollen on the underside of their abdomen, which it doesn't show so much in any of these photographs, but when you see them, you'll see the underside of their abdomen will be covered in pollen. And although we typically think of mason bees are very closely associated with the orchard mason bee, there are about 130 species in the United States. The majority of those are in the western states, and some of them will be bright green, like the photograph in the lower right. Large carpenter bees, a bee that many people know, particularly in the east, where unfortunately there's conflict between the eastern carpenter bee and homeowners, because the carpenter bees will make their nest in solid wood, and sometimes that's construction lumber. That'll be your soffits or your your fence rails or your deck rail or whatever, and so that's really unfortunate. But these are big bees. They can be confused with bumblebees, but I actually have another slide that illustrates the differences there. The bees in the west, there are more species again in the west, and they don't nest in solid wood. They'll be nesting in hollow stems. And you'll see that most of the ones in the east, the main photograph there, black with the front half covered in yellow hairs, and many of the ones in the west are, lack those colors. And then some of the males in the west are these fabulous golden brown, and you think it's a totally different bee, but it's just the male is this golden color. And one way to separate these from bumblebees is that they carry the pollen dry, and you'll see that with the upper right photo there. The back leg is just covered in dry pollen, not that moist lump. Now, saying it's a slide of how to separate these from bumblebees. The top pair of images, the one on the left is a carpenter bee, and the one on the right are bumblebees. And you'll see the carpenter bee has a very shiny abdomen, and the bumblebee, the abdomen is covered in hairs and is not shiny. And that's one of the simplest ways to tell the difference between these similar bees. And in the West, some of the carpenter bees are completely black, but there are no completely black bumblebees. Even the ones that are mostly black have some yellow either on the head or the kind of just behind the head or on the body. And so that the one on the right, you can see there, you see the bands of yellow. And so you know that's not just covered in hairs and not shiny, but it's not black. Our leafcutter bees, another bee that you'll see if you have mason bee blocks, because they will also occupy the same tunnels. They are tunnel nesting bees. Some are spring, but more typically summer. And you'll see that these really clearly show carrying the abdomen on the carrying the pollen on the underside of the abdomen. You'll see there the photograph on the right, all that yellow, that's not yellow hairs or yellow bands on the body, but that's the yellow of the pollen. And the main photograph, it's a little harder to see because the pollen is similar color to the plant parts behind, but the bee has this pointed abdomen, and then you can see a rounded halo beyond that, and that's the pollen being carried. And these are robust, chunky little bees, again, like the mason bees, and that's partly because they use their jaws, and you can see they use their jaws for cutting out the leaf pieces that they use for making their nest. And so there's a lot of muscle associated with their jaws, and therefore a very broad head to hold that muscle and to give them those strong jaws. The sweat bees are another one of the rather drab families of bees. Like mining bees, generally brown or gray. They also will carry their pollen fairly high up on their legs. You can see on the main photo there, you can see the rear leg and the long hairs there, the well spaced for packing the pollen in. But typically the sweat bees are less hairy on the thorax, the front part of their body, and have hairs on the abdomen, the rear part of their body. So that's a relatively simple way to separate most mining bees from sweat bees. The sweat bees are found almost everywhere. There are very few, there's not that many species at all in the United States, but they are probably one of the most ubiquitous and possibly the most abundant of the bees, and they seem to be very adaptable to changing conditions. They range in size from more than ½ an inch down to a little more than a quarter of an inch. And so that may be why some people don't see these, because once you get to the smaller bees, people don't always recognize them as bees. They think they're flies or gnats or bugs, something other than a bee. One thing is illustrated here that I haven't really touched on so far, the difference between male and female bees. The main photograph is a female bee, and the photo on the upper right is a male bee. Male bees, many of them have a more slender body. They don't have, the females have to generate eggs, so they have a bigger body to cope with that. But also male bees are not carrying pollen. So if you compare the leg between the female and how hairy it is and the male, and it's just a skinny leg, there's nothing there. But then the other thing is the length of the antennae. Male bees have longer antennae than the female. In fact, if you were to get really close, if you had one of these in your hand in a tube and a hand lens, you could actually count them, and you will see that male bees have one extra antennal segment than the females. And for most males, that means they have 13 segments and the females have 12. But that's getting into crazy detail. There are some groups of bees where the different length in the antennae is really obvious, but for something like a sweat bee, I mean, it is obvious if you've looked at enough sweat bees, but just at a first glance, you probably won't be noticing the comparative length. I'll say a little bit more about the sweat bee nesting, because these are really interesting bees. They nest in the ground with the narrow tunnels and the brood cells. But there are, many of these species have a level of sociality in their nest. And it's not a queen and her brood and a queen and her offspring. It's female bees that get together and share the work, which is really intriguing. And so you'll have one female who's the primary egg layer in the nest, and then a small number of other females who are helping her tend those eggs, dig the nest, forage, etc. And so you wouldn't notice this from above ground necessarily, because all you'll see is that little hole into the ground. But underground, you've got this intriguing cooperative social life going on. And in these social nests, you'll have several broods of workers through the year, and not just that single generation. And you may have as many as 200 bees in a nest by the end of the summer. And intriguingly, the level of sociality isn't based upon a species of sweat bee, but it seems to depend on the environment. In cooler areas or in areas with fewer flowers, you typically get a solitary bee, and so one female will make her own nest. But in warmer areas or areas with an abundance of flowers, you might find these bees in a social nest. And so that's just fascinating. And one thing that I continue to find intriguing about bees is just the endless quirks and behaviors. And I mean, there's so much to learn. Moving on from the striped sweat bees to the small sweat bees, and these are really tiny. These can be like 1/10 of an inch to 0.3 or 1/4 of an inch long. And some of them have a few stripes on them. Some of them are just solid colors. And these frequently, you just see a kind of shimmering movement over a flower. And you will see that things like these bees are so small that it's beginning to show through in the photograph on the upper right there. You begin to get that kind of rainbow effect on the wings. It looks a bit like oil on a puddle. And the wings are so thin that they seem to reflect light back differently. And so you get this kind of interference. And so the wings at rest can sometimes have kind of a rainbow-like look to them, with just I'd say it's more like a puddle with just different colors in the wings. But apart from that, these are just very small, dark colors. You can see that they carry pollen, but if they're not carrying pollen, it's not that obvious. And even if they are, these bees are so small, the features on them are not that easy to see. This is a really easy to spot, easy to identify group of bees, metallic green sweat bees. Most of the females are just this fabulous metallic emerald ruby colored color. Not ruby, but emerald for sure. But many of them have golden flecks of reflected light coming back, and fabulous. The males are always green at the front end and striped at the back end. Some of the females have striped abdomens, but most of them are solid colors. And they are, they're roughly the size of a honeybee, mostly. They nest in the ground. And again, they have kind of interesting nesting behaviors because they will be communal, which is different from social. Social means that the eggs, the bees in the nest are helping to tend the nest. But communal means that they use the one nest entrance. It's a bit like an apartment complex. Or, you might have a house split into smaller units. Everybody uses the front door. But once you're through the front door, people live a separate life. And so you might have one nest entrance with several females, each of which is creating their own brood cells, their own nest tunnels underground. The small carpenter bees, we've talked about large carpenter bees. They're not related. This is a different genus. This is Ceratina. and not Xylocopa for the large carpenter bees. They share the carpenter bee name because it's one of the few other bees that will chew out its own nesting tunnel. They don't nest in solid wood. They have to have a soft-scented twig to get into, something like a blackberry or raspberry or a sumac. But their jaws are not strong enough to be able to chew through the bark or the tough outside of the twig. They need a broken twig to be able to get in. These are very small. The majority of them are, a quarter of an inch or less. There are some species that are bigger than that. Mostly they are shiny, and that's one of their most obvious features, is they're shiny. Slight green tinge to them, a slight blue tinge maybe, but mostly just dark and shiny. They don't carry much pollen on the outside of their body. They have a few hairs on the legs, and so you don't see much pollen. They often sometimes carry pollen in their crop, so kind of in their throat. And they can be pretty easily confused with wasps when you first see them. Longhorn bees are common in the summer. They are hairy. Most of them are brown and striped. The photograph on the upper right is one of the eastern species, and that one's black. But they do carry their pollen on their rear legs. A lot of pollen, a lot of hairs. You can see the main photo, the hairs on the rear leg there, and on the photo of the black bee, you'll see the yellow pollen being carried there. They're pretty big, robust bees, and this is one where it's really easy to tell the difference between male and female bees because of the length of the antennae. And the photo on the lower right there shows you the hugely long extended antennae on the males. And this is the reason why these bees are called longhorn bees. And there are a whole group of bees that have similar longhorned males, but don't all carry the same name. These sunflower bees are closely related to the Melissodes, the last group. Also a summer bee, also hairy and robust. Also the males have very long antennae. These are called sunflower bees because many of the species forage only on sunflower, but they almost all forage on similar flowers, or cactus, or some of them are evening primrose. They carry pollen dry on the rear leg, and it's like a crazy amount of pollen that they'll be carrying. Sometimes the lump of pollen would appear to be bigger than the body of the bee itself. And so that's a good thing to look out for. These bees have they're big and robust and hairy, but the hairs are very dense, so dense that the hairs on the body often looks velvety. And so when you're looking, if you happen to see a female longhorn, a Melissodes, compared to a female Sphaestra, the Sphaestra will be like chunkier and look more robust and solid, but also the hairs will look very dense and velvety. Another specialist bee, these are the squash bees, and these are so closely related to the flowers of squash, pumpkin, zucchini, and they specialize on gathering pollen only from those flowers. In fact, the pollen of those flowers is very big, and so they carry the pollen on their rear legs on a scopa of stiff hairs, but the hairs are relatively sparse and spread out compared to, say, the Sphaestra of the last photo. And that's because of the size of the pollen grains that they're carrying. They are ground nesting bees, and they will often nest in the ground around the pumpkins. And so they may live out their entire life cycle within a very small area. Mostly when you see these bees, you only see the back end. And so knowing that they're striped and the back end's not so hairy is a really good thing to know. And they are pretty distinctive once you see them. But also, if you see the face, they have a really obvious protruding kind of nose. that sticks out much further than other bees. The carder bees, interesting, they are in the same family as the leafcutters and the mason bees, and so they live in tunnels, but they divide their tunnel up with downy hairs from plants. And so they'll collect it. And that photograph on the lower left there, you can see that the center part of that leaf has been scraped clean of the hairs. And that's what the carder bees have used to make their nest. And that's why they're called carder bees, because carding is, if you're creating fabric, carding is when you take the fluff off the fabric as part of the manufacturing process. These bees are fairly easy to identify. They have distinctive patterns of markings on their body. You can see that they're black and with these yellow patches. There are 35 or more species in total in the United States. Again, diversity is much greater in the West than the East. There's only a handful of species in the East. And there are 2 species that are not native. In fact, one of those non-native species is probably the most common seen, particularly in gardens. And they have managed to spread across the country since they were introduced about 50 years ago, remarkably quickly. And so this is one that you will find in gardens. And this is one where I also have a male. The photo on the upper right there is a male, because males are very territorial. And often you'll be aware of the males before you're aware of the females, because the males will try and chase other insects, potential competitors, out of their breeding territory. The males will claim a patch of good-looking plants and then chase other insects away, and they'll also try and chase people away. And so some people have called these headbutting bees, because the bees will hover right in front of your face and have been known to bump into your forehead, which seems pretty aggressive and frightening, but they don't have a stinger, so they can't sting you. This is the last group of bees I'm going to talk about. And these are not a family, these are not connected because they're all the same genus, but these are connected by behavior. These are cuckoo bees. And I know we think of bees as being those hardworking animals, and these are like, some people might call these the lazy bees, because these bees do not make their own nest. They will go into the nest of another bee and lay their eggs while the host bee is away. Once the egg hatches, once the host has completed the cell and sealed it up and moved on, once the cuckoo bee's egg has hatched, its larvae is very mobile, unlike other bees, and it will be able to move around the cell, and it'll find the larvae or the egg of the host bee and then destroy it. But it doesn't consume that. It consumes the bee bread, the nectar and pollen in the nest. And these are very variable in size and color. Because they don't make their own nest, they don't have hairs, obvious hairs or scopa or capicula for carrying pollen. They look more robust because they have a thicker kind of shell integument, because they're more likely to end up in a battle with the host, and they frequently look pretty much like a wasp, but they are fairly abundant. It's almost surprising how many different genera of cuckoo bees there are, and if you have bee nests, you're going to have these. There are some great books out there. I forgot to include on this slide another book. Our Attracting Native Pollinators book has a series of profiles towards the end of it that will introduce these various groups and more in more detail. The Bees in Your Backyard is a really great book if you want to get more into understanding and identifying the bees. Again, straightforward, it's great information. And then there's a book that I forgot to include on this board, on this panel slide, is Bumblebees of North America, which is a really great guide that will help you identify and understand your bumblebees. There are also some websites that I would recommend you get to know. There's Discover Life website. The URL there goes all the way through to bees, but if you just go to discoverlife.org, then you'll find the links through to bees, and they have a lot keys that will help you step through and begin to identify bees in more detail. There's also Bug Guide, which is crowdsourced. You can upload your photos to it and other people will help you identify them, or you can just scroll through the many galleries of bee information. Another one called Exotic Bee ID, and there, although I've been talking about native, there are 20 or so non-native species of bees in North America, and this will help you identify those. And then if you're really serious, this is not a website. The bee course is like a 9-day intense course run by American Museum of Natural History and based in Arizona, and it's intended for biologists. Not just, I mean, biologists in the broader sense, botanists and plant taxonomists and entomologists, whoever, whose work needs a deeper understanding of bee ID, and it is a really intense, really incredible thing. And even that, more than a week, the intention is to help you identify only to the genus level, because bees are complicated. Just to close off, Xerces is donor funded, donor supported, and so if you feel that at the end of this that Xerces is worthy of your support, we'd love to have your support. And so thank you for sitting patiently through all of that. I look at my watch and I realize that I've probably talked for too long, so I would be very happy to open it up. I'll stop sharing my screen and just open it up for Q&A and questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew. You have a lot of very good questions, about 30. So we'll start working through them. Right. We probably will go over a few minutes over the hour, just so folks know. And we've had a lot of people asking if this will be recorded. It will be on our YouTube channel by the end of Friday. So you can rewatch this, and we'll be sure to include these questions in there as well. So one question we've gotten several times from folks is, why are there more bee species in the US West as opposed to the East? So I'm assuming it's not a simple answer, but I thought I would ask anyway.
No, that is a really great question. And I don't think I can really give you, I don't think I'll give you an answer. I know that, I mean, for Oregon, and maybe this helps give the answer. Oregon has more diversity of bees in it than many other states. But it also is like, when you look at the plants in Oregon and the range of environments and ecosystems in Oregon, I mean, from what I remember reading, and I think I'm correct, but I might be wrong, Oregon is the 4th most diverse state for flowers. And given the close association with flowers and bees, it's no surprising that when you have a high diversity of plants, flowers, you get a high diversity of bees. And within Oregon, you go from ocean beaches to alpine meadows to high desert, and from rainforest, temperate rainforest, through to serpentine. And so it's a very, I mean, remarkably diverse state. And I suspect that if you were to do a broad scale look at the country east of the Mississippi and west, you're going to find something similar, that west has a wider range of environments and flowers. So that's a great question. I'm going to go away and see if I can figure that out now. but that's just my initial thoughts on it.
All right, thank you. Which bee makes holes in the cement between bricks at my house?
which no, that's lovely, lovely question. Which one? There are some. I'm scratching my head because there are some bees that will nest, because most bees don't nest in such a hard substrate. There are some that will nest literally in sandstone and have to collect water to soften the sandstone enough to be able to dig into it. And so there, and it will also depend on where you are in the US, because there are different bees. And I'm trying to think. If I remember correctly, it may be one of the Diadacia, which is one of the sunflower bees. But no, there we go. If that questioner could just send the question direct to me via email. And my email is matthew.shepherd@xerces.org. I would be happy to check into that and give a direct answer.
I'll put his email in the chat in a minute here.
Thank you.
He'll probably get inundated with questions. Are you good, right?
Oh yeah, no, I realized what I was doing.
Okay, this is a good question because I think people are concerned about it. How can I keep the parasitic wasps out of my mason bee homes?
You probably can't keep them out of your mason bee homes. Anytime you create the right kind of conditions to support one form of wildlife, you're going to support all the other wildlife that relies upon that initial. And so the parasitic wasps are a part of the natural life cycle of bees, which is unfortunate. One of the things, if you have mason bee nests, if you have large nests, and you sometimes see this, people promoting, they call them bee walls, or sometimes they call them bee hotels, and it's a really big structure full of all sorts of different, logs and blocks and straws and canes, etc., etc. Anytime, if you put a lot of nests in one place, you're more likely to be attracting the parasites and the kleptoparasites, because they're going to be drawn to a bigger food resource. And so if you have smaller nests, and by small I mean like 8 to 10 nesting tunnels, and you spread those around, then you're not concentrating the food supply, and so you may not get such a high concentration of the parasites, parasitoids, and so on. And specifically with mason bees, you can pull the tubes out of the nest and you can clean them, and so you can control the parasitism level by doing away with the parasitized brood cells and cocoons, and then you're only putting out the clean ones at the end.
All right, thank you. So back to some identification questions. This person's asking, how are mason bees and leafcutter bees distinguished?
Sure. Mason bees, at least the kind of the orchard mason bee, is the shiny metallic look, and most leafcutter bees are not shiny. Most leafcutter bees are fairly dark with stripes. There are some leafcutter bees that are hairier all over. There's one actually that nests in the ground, which is relatively unusual for a leafcutter, and that's hairy all over, but it's not metallic. The other thing about many of the leafcutter bees is that they do have the more pointed abdomen, and they have a rather odd stance when you see them on a surface, is that they'll sit, and their head's down and the abdomen is up, and so they look like this almost like a, anyway, but so they stick their abdomen up in the air, which is fairly distinctive. But then, given the number of species, you will find some leafcutter bees that are, that are metallic and look more like a mason bee. But just broadly, though, those are the simpler ways to separate them out.
It's a difficult question. There's a lot to look at. This person's asking what your opinion is of I'm Naturalist for identifying species through photographs.
I love iNaturalist, and there's also the Seek app that's intended, actually, I hadn't realized, but it's intended for kids, but it's a handy thing because you can just go around and just take a photograph or point it at something, and then it will search through the iNaturalist database. But anytime you're identifying a bee from a photograph, it's always going to be challenging. There are some where you can say, oh, it's a mason bee, or it's a sweat bee. You can make broad divisions like that, but you may not be able to drill down to species level. Some groups are easier. Bumblebees are easier to get to species level by just looking at them, but that's because of the color stripes. The metallic green sweat bees are easy because they're bright green. But for some of the other bees, and even to get successfully to genus level, and if anybody was lucky enough to get to do the bee course, you'll discover that sometimes just to get to genus level, it'll be some tiny little detail like what shape are the tips of the hairs on a certain segment of the body. And so there's just a limit to what you can achieve with photos. But that said, I think iNaturalist is great, and the more people who are submitting photos, the better it will become because it's crowdsourced. And it really will help you identify to the kind of level that I've been talking about today.
Great, thank you, Matthew. Interesting question. This person read about one type of bee that carries pollen in its crop. Is it a type of bee that we haven't listed here yet?
The bees that carry, yeah, probably. Because I know there are so many bees that I didn't get around to. There are, for example, the yellow-faced bees, which are tiny little bees, and they would be carrying pollen in the crop for sure. Some of the small carpenter bees will also carry some in the crop. But it's probably the yellow-faced bees that person had read about.
All right, thank you. So this question is an interesting one. I'm just going to see. You can tell me, we can move on if you want. But they're asking, do cuckoo bees serve any purpose?
Do they serve any purpose? It depends on what you mean by purpose. I mean, purpose to people, purpose to the environment, purpose to ecology. I mean, I'm sure cuckoo bees get eaten by other stuff. I'm sure cuckoo bees do travel between flowers because although they're not making their own nest, they still feed in the same way that wasps will go to flowers and feed on nectar and pollen. And in doing that, some of it gets stuck to them and some of it gets moved around between flowers. So they probably do contribute to pollination in some level. But I mean, I know we talk about bees as being pollinators, and we talk about how they carry pollen, but bees are very efficient at carrying pollen. And particularly if it's a bumblebee or a honeybee where it's moist. Once it's moist, it's not going to be very helpful for pollinating flowers. And so the actual pollination is a chance act. The bee's not going out to pollinate. The bee's going out to feed itself, forage, collect food, take it back to its nest. And so for all bees and other pollinators, the pollen that gets transferred from one flower to another is just that kind of what you might call spare pollen, the stuff that they couldn't clean off successfully. And so cuckoo bees certainly would be doing that.
All right. We have a question about Bumblebee Watch, if you wouldn't just mind mentioning it and describing what it is a little bit.
Yeah, Bumblebee Watch is a community science project that's run across the United States and Canada. It's a partnership between several organizations, including Wildlife Preservation Canada and Bee Spotter and University of Ottawa, if I remember correctly, and some others. And I apologize if I can't remember them all. But it's managed by Xerces, and it allows you to take photographs of bumblebees wherever you see them, and then you can submit them to either to the website, which is bumblebeewatch.org, or there is an iPhone, certainly an iPhone app, and I don't remember if there's an app for other phones. And what it means is that you can upload your photographs. There's a key within Bumblebee Watch that will allow you to try to identify the species you're looking at. And so from that perspective, you can get to learn about what you're looking at. But also the app allows us and the other partners to build up an ever bigger database of bumblebee observations, distributions across the country, because when we started this, we were aware that a lot of areas no one had really looked to see what the bumblebees were. And our first community science effort for bumblebees was focused on a few bumblebees that we knew were declining. And so we wanted to gather information on that. And we realized that we're not gathering information on everything, and so it grew and it became an effort, because even the bumblebees that we consider to be common, we don't necessarily know details of their distributions or abundance. And so Bumblebee Watch has the two benefits. It helps people identify what they're looking at and seeing, but also helps us build up a ever-growing, ever-improving picture of bumblebee distributions, which we can share with land managers and scientists everywhere.
Right. Do only female bees have the pollen-carrying structures?
Yes. Males don't make a nest, so they don't have pollen-carrying structures.
So in follow-up to your question previously about pollen, this person is asking that you made an interesting point that if pollen is moist, it's not as effective at pollinating. And if their follow-up question really is, how then are honeybees so good at pollinating crops because their pollen is moist? Is that correct?
Yeah, it's because they don't clean all the pollen off their bodies. It's probably most obvious if you're watching a bumblebee or some of the longhorn bees, because when they go and forage, they're not neatly gathering the pollen to put away. I mean, they're just rummaging around and gathering up, so pollen gets stuck all over them. And even with 6 legs, you can clean your face and you can clean your back, and you can gradually move the pollen down to put it into the pollen basket or the scoper, whichever they have, but they don't get all the pollen off their body, and so some of it is still stuck to their face or their underside or their other legs or whatever, and so it does get enough pollen gets transferred. And particularly with honeybees as a crop pollinator, you're putting in large densities of hives. The farmer will know how many hives is required for an acre of crop, and so they have that many hives putting in, and so you can flood an area with enough honeybees to provide the pollination that's necessary.
All right. Do you have any tips for photographing bees for identification purposes? And another person had asked, are there any ways to identify bees without actually having to catch them?
Yeah, I mean, photos are great. I mean, smartphones now, I'm always impressed with the quality of photos that you can get from those. And you don't need to have the perfect photo to be able to identify a bee from it. I mean, there are, you can have expensive camera gear. There are some compact cameras now which have remarkable zoom capacity, which allow you to get a close-up photo without being too close to the bee. As well as, you can get those little macro lenses that go onto your smartphone to boost your possibility of getting a good photo. But yeah, with taking photos, bees will be startled by movement, and particularly movement. If they go into shadow, then they'll move. So you do have to move fairly stealthily around a bee, but you might be surprised once you get used to that, just how close you can get without them being concerned and flying off. Once they're foraging, they're pretty well focused on foraging, and they are aware of movement around them, because although they have the big compound eyes on the side of their head, on the top you can see it, they have 3 just very simple eyes on the top that probably only pick up light and shade. And that's why if you walk between the sun and them, and your shadow crosses over them, then they're going to move. So generally it's learning to move stealthily. Have the equipment that you've got. You don't need special equipment. You can do pretty well with a smartphone these days, and be prepared to identify from less than perfect photos. You don't need if you go out there and you take a photo, don't worry if it's not perfect focus, or it's the bees at a funny angle, or in any of that. Just try and take the photo. I do find sometimes that if you're taking video rather than trying to take a still photo, that can help, because you can start the video as you're approaching, and so as you come in, you can be videoing as you're getting closer, rather than waiting and trying to get that perfect position to take the photo, because in the end, any photo is better than no photo for trying to identify. But photos do have the limitations for trying to get to species level, for example, just because that you may need to look at the wing vein patterns, or some strange other detailed structure that you won't be able to see without a microscope.
All right, so since we talked about honeybees, it's inevitable. A few people have asked, is beekeeping detrimental to native bees, and are they really competing with our native bees? And I do want to note we will likely have a webinar on this coming up next or in the winter or fall, but I thought, Matthew, I would give you that question and you can touch on that.
Yeah, honeybees compete with native bees. There's no doubt about that. Honeybees are looking for trying to get to the nectar and pollen, and you have a hive and you're going to have a lot of honeybees nearby. There's a possibility of disease spread from honeybees to native bees. So yeah, honeybees are a potential competition, and having a hive in your backyard is just going to add more bees to a landscape that may not be able to support bees at the moment, and that's why our focus is on habitat. We focus on trying to expand the area of habitat so there's more flowers available to bees. We focus on trying to make sure there's the nesting areas available, the bare ground, the twigs, the snags, etc., that native bees will need. The nesting, there's not going to be competition between honeybees and native bees for nesting, because honeybees are nesting in very different places. We would always encourage people, if you want to have a hive in your backyard, think about it, and think about whether you really want the bees, or why you're doing it. Because if you're doing it because you want to quote, to save the bees, adding another hive is not going to save or help native bees is not going to increase the habitat that's available to bees. It's not going to be changing the pesticide use that's harming bees. But if you want it because you want a fascinating relationship with a really cool insect, that's fine. Just please also focus on increasing the flowers that are available and get more habitat out there.
All right, shifting a little bit to some bee behavior. We have time for a couple more questions here. This person's asking, they see bees on flowers and they look like they're sleeping. Are they sleeping? Are they at the end of their life? Are they not moving because they have too much pollen?
Sorry, are the bees not moving because there's too much pollen?
Yeah, they're just asking why they're not moving. If they actually are sleeping, are they maybe not alive anymore?
Yeah, I mean, if you're seeing the bees in the evening, most bees rely upon the temperature around them to be warm enough to be active. You will see some bees they're out too late in the evening, for example, and so they just get too cool to be able to fly. Bumblebees are unusual in that because they can warm themselves up. They have the ability to disconnect their wings from their wing muscles, and then they just shiver their wing muscles and can generate enough heat internally to be able to make themselves warm enough to be able to fly. So it's unusual to see bumblebees getting caught, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And there are other bees which will male bees, for example, cuckoo bees, another example, but typically we see male bees. Male bees don't have a nest. So they don't have anywhere to return to in an evening or overnight to sleep. So male bees will be spending the night on vegetation. And there are the longhorn bees, for example, the males will gather in sleeping aggregations. And so you might find 3, 4, 10, 20, I mean, sometimes more, but that would be pretty spectacular if you saw more than 20 bees in one sleeping cluster. But you do see this happen, and the male bees will clamp themselves on using their mandibles, their jaws, onto the plant stem, and then just hang there motionless over the night until they warm up the next morning. So I hope that answered the question.
Yes, it did. Someone is wondering why sweat bees are called sweat bees, and they apologize if they missed you seeing it.
No, it's funny. I didn't say that. It was in my notes, but I was like, I'm talking too much. I need to move on. Sweat bees are called sweat bees because they will come and drink sweat from people. It's as simple as that. And so sometimes this is something that's happened. It's happened to me a couple of times. The first time it was many years ago before I knew what's happened, and I was like, ah. But now I know if it happens to me another time, then it's not a problem. It's just they're coming for the mineral salts probably. Not all of the sweat bees do, but enough of them are so that whole group of bees has become known as sweat bees. And so as far as I know, in this country, it is only sweat that they go for, but there are some places in the world where sweat bees will go for tears as well. And I imagine that's probably a little freakier to people, to have a bee landing on your eyelashes and trying to drink from the corner of your eye. But for us, they'll just come for sweat, forehead, arms, that kind of stuff.
All right. Someone is asking about, so obviously honeybees are not native to the United States. Are there any honeybees, or to America, are there any honeybees that native bees that do make honey?
In the Americas, yes, there are a group of bees known as the stingless bees. They are primarily tropical bees. They do make it into Florida, and I can't remember if they get over the southern Texas border. But in Central America, stingless bees are traditionally the bees that are used for beekeeping. And so they make honey. And then the other bees that make a bit of honey are the bumblebees. It's funny, there is a big old debate as to whether you can call honey made by non-honeybees honey. But I think you can use the term honey to describe what these other bees make. It's not necessarily as thick as the honey from honeybees, and particularly for bumblebees, but bumblebees will collect a little bit of food and store it in the nest, probably only enough food to keep the colony going for a few days. But that does include kind of watery honey. So the honeybees are the ones who are best known for making the honey, and for whom the honey is such an important part of the colony cycle, because the honeybee colony is perennial, so they try to make sure they have enough food supplies in the hive to support the hive through periods when there are no flowers, which may mean the winter or it may mean a droughty summer. But bumblebees don't try to make it through the whole winter. Their colony dies off at the end of the summer, so they only make a little bit to keep them going for a few days.
All right, we'll find a couple more questions here. So back to providing habitat. This person is asking, when you're speaking of leaving dead twigs, etc., for tunnel nesting bees, do brush piles work as well? Meaning that they have piles of branches in their yard, and wondering if that's providing nesting areas for bees as well as other wildlife that seem to love them.
Yes, definitely. I mean, and I've seen this myself with brush piles. I've made brush piles with blackberry stems, and then small carpenter bees will go up those stems and have nested in them. So yeah, definitely. It does slightly depend on the type of branches. It needs to be the branches and twigs that have soft centers to them. So this often means things like sumac or raspberries or blackberries or elderberry. So you can make brush piles with pine or oak or anything like that, for example, and you're not going to get the bees nesting up the twigs just because the wood is too dense for them to be able to chew into.
All right, a lot of people are asking questions about what type of flowers to plant. Obviously, we have people from all over. On this webinar, can you suggest any resources for folks?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Our website has plant lists that cover most of the country. I know that we don't have plant lists for the Rocky Mountain region currently, although hopefully we'll have those soon. But if you go to our website, in fact, a good URL is bringbackthepollinators.org. And that will direct you to the Bring Back the Pollinators page on the Xerces website. And from there, it's very easy to access plant lists that will guide you to good plants for all sorts of different regions. And I think, don't we have a plant webinar coming up in a few months as well?
Yes, we do. We have a whole webinar series this summer called Bring Back the Pollinators, and one of them is on providing habitat, nesting areas specific for bumblebees, and then we also have another one that is specific to native plants, and that will be applicable nationwide. We'll have a few different staff on those.
And the other thing I would add is, if you're a book person, go to your bookstore or your library and track down a copy of Attracting Native Pollinators, because that has a lot of plant information in it. And there's another book that we also produced with Story Publishing called 100 Plants to Feed the Bees. And that, as the name suggests, is a book that just focuses on 100 plants that are good for bees.
All right, so we will end today with one last question that I think is interesting. Do bees actually smell? Why are they attracted to people?
Oh, do they smell? Huh. Yeah, I mean, yes, they do have a sense of smell. That's one of the reasons why flowers have the nice scent to them. The scent can help direct bees to where they will find the nectar and pollen. There are several different ways in which flowers have because I mean, this is like a whole different topic that we could dive into, but evolution of flowers and bees go side by side, with the flowers wanting to attract the bees or another pollinator to move the pollen around, and the bees wanting to find the flowers because that's where they get their food from. But flowers, the big petals, the colors, the markings, there are lots of different things that flowers have evolved to attract the pollinator and to direct the pollinator in to where they will find the nectar and pollen. Scent is one part of that helps direct the bees in. So yeah, the bees do, I mean, smell may not be the right word because it's not through their nose, but they have ways of recognizing and following those scents.